Hello. Is everything working? Hello, looks like everything's running. All right, so Dead Space Catalyst, Part 3. This title description I have from chapter 12 to 20, we'll see splitting this into two parts. They're still fairly significant chunks of size of chapters, so depending on how my voice is, if it tires out way beforehand, maybe part three and part four will be split into three chunks just to make it easier, manageable. Otherwise, I don't know how I'm going to read these on a Tuesday and a Thursday. Either way, This Space Catalyst by B.K Evenson, part 3, starting with chapter 12. In the dream, Jency found himself in an unfamiliar room, strapped into something that resembled a dentist chair, but wasn't quite that exactly. Besides, why would a dentist have to strap someone down? Still, it moved like a dentist chair, rising slowly up and falling slowly down, according to how a technician next to him applied pressure with his foot to the controls. The technician was wearing a white coat, like a dentist's coat, but he wasn't a dentist. Jency could tell because of his teeth. Some were crooked and thrust every which way, and others were simply missing, and all of them were stained a yellowish brown. His breath was bad, too, almost unbearable, and his coat was spattered with what looked like old blood. "What am I doing here?" asked Jency in the dream. The technician laughed. "What are you doing here?" he asked. He lifted both hands and Jency caught a flash of metal in one. "You've always been here," the technician said. There was, hanging from the ceiling, a strange rubbery contraption, like an inverted dentist's chair, and once the technician had lifted and lowered Jensen's chair to his satisfaction, he reached up and pulled it down. It was some sort of pliable plasticine substance, and it closed around the Jency, molding itself firmly against his body. Mostly it was soft, but here and there it pushed at him, hard little points touching his arms, his legs, in a way that made it difficult to move. What was hidden within it? And then he felt a little pricking as one of the hard points pushed its way further into him. A needle of some sort, then another, until it was hard for him to breathe since it made the needles, if they were needles, sink in even deeper. The technician slid his hand underneath the plasticine covering, and when he slid it back out again, it was slick with blood. It was hard for Jency not to feel alarm, but the harder he breathed, the more his chest hurt. The needles jabbing deeper, making him burn, so he tried to breathe in short, sharp breaths and raise his chest not at all. But he suddenly realized, beginning to hyperventilate. His head getting exceptionally dizzy and black spots beginning to appear before his vision. Unless the needles were injecting something into him, and it was the drug he was feeling. "I'm going to ask you a few questions," said the technician, his voice extremely flat. "No," said Jency, and felt a stab of pain. The technician ignored him. "Let's start with an easy one," he said. "What is your name?" Jency shook his head. "Wrong answer," said the technician. "I'll ask again. What is your name?" "I," said Jency. "Please, these answers are also incorrect," said the technician. "Please try again." He leaned forward, and for a moment his voice wasn't flat, but friendly. "I'm surprised at you," he said. "This is the easiest question. If you struggle to answer this one, how are you possibly going to manage the rest?" Before Jency could respond, the technician leaned back, his face becoming neutral again. I will repeat the question. What is your name?" The black spots had nearly overwhelmed his vision. He could barely see the technician now, and what he could see of him was covered in overlapping circles of darkness, as if the man was either just coming into or just fading out of existence. I, he tried again, and then screamed as the needles jabbed, and then managed in a half strangled voice, "Jency!" "Closer," said the technician, "but still wrong. Would you like, would you care to try again?" But no, thought Jency, trying to plead to the technician with his eyes. "That's my name, that's really it. I've answered correctly, let me go." The technician waited there patiently, his face expressionless, while Jency kept taking quick, shallow breaths. Finally, he said, "Would you like me to give you a hint?" Very slowly and deliberately, the technician raised his hand, and Jency saw that the flash he had seen before was not metal after all, but a mirror. For a moment, the technician misdirected it, and Jency only saw it in bits and pieces of the walls, and then it caught the light and flashed hard at him, momentarily blinding him. And then he caught a wavering glimpse of his reflection and realized that the face he was seeing was not his own, but that of his brother Istvan. His body was tingling when he woke up. He rubbed his arms, almost expecting to see marks from the needles, but there was nothing there. He had to get up and go look at his face in the mirror, just to make sure that it was really him and not Istvan. For once, he was reassured to see his own haggard face and red-rimmed eyes, the proof of another night of uneasy dreams and little sleep. After that, he had trouble falling back to sleep, was worried about having the same dream over again. He made the bed and then lay on top of it, thinking, "I did everything I could for Istvan," he told himself. "When we were together, I tried to help him and keep him out of harm's way. Later, I tried to stop him from doing something rash. Later still, I spent months and then years looking for him. I did everything I could." Still, despite saying it, he did not quite believe it. He had not found his brother. How could he say he had done everything he could when his brother was still missing? It was a hard day. He was, for one thing, exhausted, even more so than usual. For another, he found his thoughts returning throughout the day to his brother, wondering where he was now. Enough had started to come out now about the methods used by the CS. Maybe they had driven him mad, made him even madder than he already was. Maybe they had crippled or maimed him, even killed him. Did he really want to know what happened to his brother? Would Istvan even be the same person if he were to get him back? "I'll think about him for a few days, and then slowly forget about him again," he told himself. "Life will continue on as normal. Even if I didn't find him, I can hardly be blamed." But a few days came and went, and he was still thinking about his brother, unable to help himself. And so he did what he usually did when this happened. He filed another request with the military to be allowed to have contact with his brother, knowing that it, just like all the petitions he had filed before it, would simply vanish. It would not even be acknowledged, but at least his conscious mind could now tell his unconscious that it had tried to do something. He was still working the same picking job as he had been 4 years earlier, back when his brother had disappeared. He piloted a small cargo ship designed to shift freight from local orbital spacecraft to the larger shock point ships in orbit and vice versa. He showed up in the morning, was given a series of deliveries and pickups, and worked with a small crew until they were done. If everything went right, he could do the job in 8 hours or so. If he'd have to stay until things were taken care of, and even if he went over his 8-hour shift, he never got overtime. But it was a job, and the economy was bad. He was lucky to have anything at all. The piloting was far from intense, nothing beyond what he might be trained for in the first few weeks of military flight school, except for the docking procedures. But it was something anyway. He wasn't making much money, wasn't saving any, but he was getting by. And then, a few weeks later, he came home to find a vid message waiting for him. It was from his mother. It was surprising. He hadn't heard from her since her confinement in the asylum, where she looked relatively okay, though. Her hair combed, her eyes drifting a little bit, but not darting about like they used to do. Plus, she was able to form coherent, unslurred sentences, even if she only said a few words. "Jency," she said, "I need to see you. Come see me." It didn't make sense. Why would his mother call? She'd always blamed him for Istvin's disappearances. She always blamed him for Istvin's disappearance, and a few times early on that he tried to see her, she turned his request to visit down. Even then, he hadn't particularly wanted to see her, but he'd felt obliged. Istvin, still feeling guilty about his brother, he couldn't stop himself from trying to contact her. But by vid rather than in person. No, in person would be too much. It took a while for the hospital staff to acknowledge that he had a right to communicate with her, and then even longer for them to track her down and bring her to a vid. She didn't look as good as she had in the first vid. Her hair was sticking out in all directions, and now her face had a slackness to it as well, as if she had perhaps just been medicated. Seeing her like that, he couldn't help but say, "You haven't called me for years. Why are you calling me now?" He had to repeat it twice before she understood what he was saying. For a moment, she stumbled over her words, babbled almost, and then managed to say, "But I've finally forgiven you." "Forgiven me?" said Jency. "For what?" "For what you did to your brother," she said. "I forgive you." Jency felt himself beginning to fill with rage. "But I didn't do anything to Istvin," he said. "Whatever happened to him is not my fault. Whatever happened to him, he brought upon himself." "I need you to come," she said, her voice strange now, high-pitched and screeching. "Why should I come? What did you ever do for me?" "Come and be saved." He cut the feed, angry as hell, feeling it had been a mistake to humor her and talk to her at all. A few hours later, he had a brief pre-recorded message from Henry, who was now working off-world, doing security for a special facility. "Very hush-hush," he said, and winked. "Can't tell you much about it. Very lucrative as well. It'll give me the step-up I need, the capital to start something decent back on Vindauga. I hope you'll be part of it." When he tried to examine the location marker of the message, Jency found it had been stripped. Not only did it not indicate a particular location, it didn't even pinpoint a specific planet or even solar system. What could Henry be up to? His dreams had faded, and he had almost forgotten about Istvin again, when he had another live vid feed from the hospital. Thinking it must be his mother, he rejected it, but the call came back immediately, this time with an emergency designation. Curious despite himself, he accepted it. It was the director of the asylum. "There's no easy way to put what I have to say," he said. "Then just say it," said Jency. His mind was racing out in front of him, imagining his mother going berserk and attacking another patient, or a doctor, or a visitor, or imagining the director saying that the public assistance funds had reached their end and that they could no longer take care of her. Because of that, paradoxically, it was almost a relief when he learned that his mother was dead. She had a cerebral hemorrhage, the director informed him. A cerebral hemorrhage? She had a brain scan not long before, and nothing was there to make us worry. But things can change quickly. There was probably nothing that could have been done. Jency thanked the man and hung up the phone. He sat down and tried to feel something, but wasn't sure what to feel. He felt some anger, some loss, some grief, but it was nothing compared to what he felt over the distance of his brother. Oh, sorry. But it was nothing compared to what he felt over the disappearance of his brother. And his mother was gone, was dead. His brother might still be alive. I need to find him, he thought. I haven't done enough. But he was helpless to know where to start. "13. Groder sat up on the bed and ruffled his hair, then leaned over and answered the vid. On the screen was one of the men who Blackwell had introduced him to. "Ah, it's you," Groder said. "Expecting someone else?" said the man. Groder shrugged. "Do you know what time it is here?" he asked. "Last I checked, you were on a ship rather than a planet," said the man, "which means time doesn't really apply." Groder grunted. "What am I even supposed to call you?" he asked. "What's your name?" The man gave a strange smirk. You can refer to me as the Gray Man," he claimed. "The Gray Man?" "It's a name that someone gave me," said the man. Yes, Gerda realized. His face did look somewhat gray. "He'll serve as well as any other." "What do you want?" he asked. "Where's Blackwell?" "Now we get down to it," said the man. He smiled. "We figured it was time to cut out the middleman. Saves time and saves confusion. It's simpler." And then he added, without transition, "Fisher's been killed." "Killed?" said Groder, surprised. "What happened?" "Shot," said the man. "Head blown off. We've interrogated the man responsible, one Istvan Sato. He doesn't seem to know anything. Strangely enough, it seems actually to be a coincidence, which means the project should be able to go forward without impediment. He's a man with severe mental problems. There's something about him, though, that intrigues me." Groder nodded. "Why are you telling me this?" he asked. "'Cause he'll be arriving at the prison camp on Aspera," he said. "We don't expect anything to happen to suggest we were wrong about it being a coincidence, but we wanted someone there to be aware of him, just in case anything came up. That's why we contacted you. Blackwell didn't need to know." "I appreciate the faith you put in me," he said. "It's not a question of putting faith in you," said the man. "It's a question of us losing faith in Blackwell. His motives are, shall we say, impure." Groder remained impassive. "You'll notice we haven't contacted Arthur," said the man. He's Blackwell's pawn, not ours. As for you, we've always preferred a knight to a pawn." "I don't know whether to feel insulted," said Groder. "Of course you don't," said the man. "Now turn off the vid and go back to sleep, and try to pretend this was all a bad dream." Excuse me, I can feel chapped lips, and it's actually bothering me a bit when I'm trying to read this. 14. In a fit of desperation, he considered joining the Colonial Marines. If he did that, maybe after years of hard work and faithful service, he'd be in a position where he'd be given sufficient security clearance to be able to gain access to information about his brother. But then again, maybe not. Still, what else could he do? Maybe develop his computer skills further and hack his way into the system. He'd never been terrible with computers, but he was hardly an expert either. And how would he know where to start? He was considering these and other schemes when a live feed changed everything. He was lucky to catch it. Normally, he would have been at work during that time, but he'd traded shifts with someone who had a funeral to attend. Even so, he was lucky to see it. The vid request came in without a name or a location marker, and so at first glance, he figured it was just an ad, something new put together by a vidi marketer. But there was a flash, but there flashed into his mind the recorded vid from Henry. That too had no location marker, and so he connected. It was Henry this time too. He was hunched towards he was hunched toward the vid screen, difficult to see. He was whispering. He looked nervous and cagey and kept glancing back over his shoulder. It took him a moment to realize the connection had been made. "Henry," said Jency. "What a great surprise." "Shh," said Henry. "Not so loud. I shouldn't be calling out at all, let alone using this channel. If they find out I did, at the very least it'll cost me my job." "What's wrong, Henry?" Henry shook his head. "I'm calling you just so you'll stop worrying about your brother. He's here. He's alive. He's okay. You don't need to worry about him anymore. That's all I can tell you." Jency felt his heart leap. He's here, Henry? I have to where's here, Henry? I have to know." "I can't tell you," said Henry. "It doesn't matter. What matters is he's okay." "Is he a prisoner? What's happened to him?" It's a penal colony," said Henry. "That's where I work. Yes, he's a prisoner. I saw him for the first time yesterday. Not in person, on vid. I almost didn't recognize him." What's wrong with him that you almost didn't recognize him?" asked Jency, his voice rising. Henry pressed his fingers to it. Henry pressed Henry pressed his finger to his lips. "You don't know what I'm risking telling you this." "It's not enough," said Jency. "I need more. I need to know where you are." "Classified," said Henry, reaching now for the off switch. "I wish I could, but Henry, think of everything we did together," said Jency hurriedly. "You've already told me enough to get you in trouble. Now give me the rest." Through the screen, he saw Henry hesitating, his hand still hovering near the cutoff. "Please, Henry," he said. "I'm your best friend." And for a moment, Henry's nervousness stilled. He nodded almost imperceptibly and said one word, "Aspera." And then the screen went dead. 15. Aspera. At first he thought it was the name of the thing of the kind. The only Asperas he could come up with were a school back on Earth, now defunct, and an uninhabited and uninhabitable planet, an uncolonized world far to the edge of the galaxy and away from normal trade paths. He found a satellite image of the school. He found a satellite image of the school and saw it was collapsing. Definitely nobody there. No images seemed to exist of the planet. It had few valuable resources and had been classified off limits to industrial concerns and other interested parties. It was just one word, very little to go on. Plus what Henry had said to back it up and it was just one word, very little to go on, plus what Henry had said to back it up and the little he could infer. Maybe his brother was there somewhere on the planet. Or maybe Aspera referred to something else. Something off the vid, some off the vid corporation or lesser known location on another planet. Or maybe he'd misunderstood what Henry had said. It could have been Aspera or Haspero. Those were possibilities too, he supposed, but exploring those names didn't turn up anything substantial either. It was the first time in years he had any clear indication that Isfin was still alive. He had to ask himself, do I really want to go after my brother? If he was in the penal colony, what could he do for him? Shouldn't he leave him where he was? Despite himself, like a bad reflex, he found the same protectiveness for his older brother kicking in. Now that he suspected he knew where Isfin was, how could he stop himself from going after him? Even if he wasn't there, even if he didn't manage to see him, at least he had to try. Sorry, these pages are stuck together. 16. There were many days in which Istvin did not say a word. Days, too, when he had no real sense of who or even what he was. Very quickly, as the small gray man began to manipulate his body, drawing tool after tool out of the cabinets around him, Istvin found himself withdrawing deep inside, trying to reach a place where he would be safe, where he could watch what was happening to him but not feel it. Each time a technique would fail to get results, the small gray man would change the drugs or bring out a larger tool, and he would begin to feel it again. He would burrow deeper and deeper until at last he had nowhere else to go. His body was awash with pain and suffering. He crouched there within it, on a tiny speck that was not free of pain, but better than everything around him. Excuse me, I read that wrong. His body was awash with pain and suffering. He crouched there within it, on a tiny speck that was not free of pain exactly, but better than everything around it. What his mouth was saying, what his body was saying, he had no idea. It was as if it was operating without him. And each time he thought he couldn't stand it any longer, each time he felt like he might lose himself for good, the pain abated just a little. The small gray man would stand back and wipe the sweat off his brow, his lab coat now spattered with blood, and give him a moment to breathe. And then Isfin would feel himself stepping tentatively from where he was crouched inside, slowly starting to occupy his body again. But this was a trick, for soon enough it would start all over again and he would be forced deep into his corner again. And then one day, how many days into the flight Isfin had no way of knowing, something happened. A twinge of frustration passed ever so briefly over the gray man's gray face, and Isfin was not hidden deep enough within his body to keep his own face from smiling. The man's face darkened and he stared in on Isfin again, harder this time than he had before. Either the drugs or the instruments that the gray man was sticking into him made him feel like his body was covered with ants. Either the drugs or the instruments that the gray man was sticking into him made him feel like his body was covered with ants. Then like his body was not a body at all, but just a swarm of ants. He retreated from the pain, going back to where he'd been securing himself, where he'd been hiding, and then felt the pain follow him, coming closer and then touching him lightly. This time, though, instead of receding just on the verge of becoming unbearable, it kept coming. He felt his foot eroding away, slowly crumbling around him, and suddenly he was thrust fully against his own skin, exposed all at once to all the pain his body was feeling. He screamed and struggled and heard the gray man laugh, but then the pain was too much for him and everything went dark. For a long time, he simply wasn't there. When he did start to come back, it was at first as a mess of sensations with nothing to filter or connect them. Then slowly he began to feel like he had a vague shape and form, but that form was on fire. He tried to move but found he couldn't. Then the fire faded to a low, dull ache, and he imagined it as some form of ash. He momentarily thought, now a shadow man. But then his shape and form became sharper, clearer, and he could feel he was human. He could feel, too, that he was lying down on his side, one side of him pressed against something cold, flat, and hard. He tried to open his eyelids and succeeded in getting them to flutter, light strobing vaguely into his brain. He rested a little and then tried again. This time, his eyes came open and stayed open. He was in a small room, a cell of some kind, lying on a concrete floor, standing ajar. Next to his face was the dented metal underside of a toilet, and a little further away, a cheap cot. For a moment, he thought he was back in the cell he had been in before, just after he had shot the politician. But no, he remembered that cell had had a metal door, not bars. This was new. It took him a while to pull himself up to his feet. He was weak, his muscles not all like he remembered them, atrophied perhaps. It took some getting used to. Maybe they had changed his body, made him an inside voice and taken his body away, and then given him a new one. How long had he been like this? Months? Days, maybe? He had blacked out before. It used to happen to him all the time when he was younger, but he had always woken up feeling pretty much like he had felt to begin with. This was new. This was different. He stood there swaying, staring at the open cell door, and then went through it and out. It led into a slightly curving hall, lined on one side with cells, the other side a smooth metal wall broken at one point by a steel security door. If he followed the curve around, he suspected it would go on forever. Of all of the cells had their doors open. Most of them were empty, but in one, a heavily tattooed man sat on the bed, legs crossed at the ankles, reading. In another, a few cells down, a rail-thin man was doing push-ups. They were both dressed the same, pants and simple shirts, with a number stamped on the sleeve and a name over the pocket. And he realized he was dressed the same way. Both of them looked up as he shuffled past, curious for just an instant before their eyes returned to what they were doing. He was muttering, he realized, and giving little strangled cries. He made a conscious effort to try to stop, and did for a moment, but before he knew it, it had started up again. He followed the hall around until there was a break in the cells and an opening. Tentatively, he went through it and found it gave into a large open space surmounted by a dome. It was perhaps 40 meters in diameter. Tables with built-in benches were scattered here and there, as well as a few vid screens. At the tables were seated several dozen men, all of them eating. He stood there watching, still mumbling, until one of them noticed him, a thick-lipped man with a scraggly beard next to him. Won't have to be force-fed today. He leaned to look at a man further down the table. That means you're out of a job, Bill. Ambler William, it read over his pocket. He grunted. Fine by me, he said. Where am I? Isvin said. Where are you? Said the first man. You're in hell, friend. Welcome. Hell? Last stop for all political prisoners, he said. He stood up, came over to Isvin. Only way to get out of here is to die. What's your name? Isvin Sato. James Waldron, said the man, holding out his hand. Isvin stared at it, waiting to see what it would do. It took him a moment to realize that Waldron intended for him to shake it. Hungry? Waldron asked once he did. When Isvin nodded, he led him over to a console set in the floor in the middle of the tables and showed him how to automatically dispense a meal. Once he had his food, he held Isvin's arm and directed him back to the table, the other men scooting down to make room for him. Isvin at first ate with vigor. Don't overdo it, said Waldron. That's your first solid meal in days. Isvin nodded, slowed down. A moment later, he was glad he had. The little he had eaten weighed heavily in his stomach. He pushed the tray back a little. Waldron and the others were watching him. Where am I? He asked again. What am I doing here? I already told you, it's hell, said Waldron. It's a penal colony, spoke up Bill from the other end of the table. A penal colony? For political prisoners, said Bill. People that will never get out of the system and that they're not prepared to have killed. At least not yet. James is right. This is the end of the line. You'll be here until you die. Isvin tried to take it in. Was all this real? What had happened between the gray man torturing him and this moment? His body had been present, but somehow he himself had not. Where then had he been? So what did you do? Asked another man, clean shaven with a haircut. Do? Asked Istvan. To get here, said the man. You must have, said Istvan. Yes, shot someone. A politician giving a speech. That's a hell of a way to express your disagreement with someone's political views, said Bill. I don't know what his political views were, said Istvan. I'm not quite sure why I shot him. The others stared at him for a moment. But you're a political prisoner, said one of them. Don't you have a cause? I don't know, said Istvan. What do you mean you don't know? I think there might have been some kind of mistake. It was supposed to be a funny joke. What's funny about it? Asked Bill. Istvan stared at him. Didn't seem to know how to respond. It sounds like you were a patsy, said Waldron. A pawn. A fall guy. Somebody wanted the man dead and figured they'd trick you into doing it. Istvan hesitated, then shrugged. But now you're here, said Waldron. Too late for explanations, said Bill. What? Bill's right, said the man who had originally asked him what he'd done. He held out his hand. Again, it took Istvan a moment to realize that he was expected to shake it. Michael Stewart, he said. Once you're here, there's no talking your way out. Whether it's a mistake or not, this is where you'll die. Where's here? Asked Istvan again. We don't know, said Michael. Somewhere off the beaten path. Somewhere off the beaten track. Some desolate planet out in the middle of nowhere that nobody is likely to accidentally stumble onto. The guards and technicians probably know, claimed Bill, but maybe they don't either. We hardly see them anyway. Istvan looked around for the guards and technicians. He didn't see any, unless they were disguised. He looked suspiciously at the men around him. Were they guards? Were they technicians? You know where the cells are? Asked Waldron. Ivan hesitated. What? Sorry. Istvan hesitated, nodded. Waldron dipped his spoon in the gravy left on his plate, used it to trace a circle in the plate's center. Here's where we are, he said. Right now, this is where we eat. We can walk or talk or play cards here most of the day. He drew a circle around the circle. This is the corridor for the cells. That's where we go at night. He dipped the spoon again, drew a further circle around this. The guards and technicians and anybody not a prisoner is out here. It may not look exactly like that, hard to say. They watch us through cameras hidden in the cells and on the struts of the dome. None of us really know how many guards and technicians there are. Maybe just a few, maybe a lot. We hardly ever see them. When we do, they're in riot gear and we can't see their faces. If it's really as isolated a location as Michael thinks, there are almost as much prisoners as we are. He licked the spoon clean, smiled. That's all we know. Istvan waited for him to go on. When he didn't, he asked, What is the spoon? The spoon? Said Waldron, surprised. He stared at it. The spoon's nothing. What's wrong with you? Istvan nodded. Yes. Now he understood. The spoon was nothing. How do we get out? He asked. Waldron's smile faded. We don't get out, he said. Haven't you been listening? There must be a way out. Only dead. We, said Michael. The guards are probably nearly as much prisoners as we are. Bill nodded vigorously. So we take over the outer ring, assuming that's what it is. Then what? Where do we go from there? Out, said Istvan. His head was beginning to throb. There is no out, said Bill. We're on a planet without a breathable atmosphere. Outside of the rings of the colony is death. We don't know that for certain, said Waldron. No, we don't, said Bill. But we're certain enough. Why would there be a dome otherwise? Maybe the dome's a trick, said Waldron, to make us think we're on a planet with non-breathable air. But the way he said it made it clear that it wasn't something he really believed. There was, Isfin noticed staring down at his feet, something near the base of the table leg. A little something that looked plant-like at first, but strangely tentacular as well. A kind of weird mold or something. He prodded it with his boot. For a moment he thought he was imagining it, seeing something that nobody else could see, but then realized Bill was watching him. Don't worry about that, Bill said. It's everywhere. It doesn't seem to be harmful, but when we try cleaning it up, it just keeps coming back. Everywhere, he thought. Everywhere. He looked around, and yes, there it was, a little bit here, a little bit there. Suddenly, Isfin clutched his head. There was something wrong with it, like a tone or sound going off somewhere within it, but in a way that flattened everything. Next to him, Waldron was saying something, but he couldn't hear it, couldn't see his lips move, no sound coming out. And then he was lying flat on his back on the floor, staring up at the dome. Something was strange within his vision, shadows darting back and forth before his eyes where no shadows should be, roaring in his ears, inarticulate yet somehow still human, still sentient. And then suddenly, nothing. "17. On the ship above the planet, hovering several miles above the research facility, Jane Haley, technician first class, pressed her palms against her temples. There was something wrong with her head. It had come suddenly, a numbing wave of pain that had swept over her and made her almost fall out of her chair. And then, almost as suddenly as it had come, it was gone. When she opened her eyes, Ensign Eric Arthur was staring at her, too attentive. Anything wrong? He asked. She shook her head. Bad headache, she said. Get those a lot? Asked Arthur, as if hoping to start a conversation. She ignored him. She looked around and saw that some of the others on the bridge looked dazed as well, though nobody as much as she. Maybe it wasn't just a headache, but something else. But what? Arthur, though, seemed unaffected, as did Commander Groder. The latter was staring at her, a look of deep curiosity in his eyes. Have you felt that before? He asked. Headaches? She said. Sure, hasn't everybody? He looked at her a moment more, then nodded. The curiosity fading. Take a few minutes away from the bridge. Gather yourself, he said. But I'm fine, sir, she said. That's an order, he said. She nodded and stood, left the bridge. An order, she thought. Since when did you have to leave the bridge if you had a headache? It was good to get away for a moment, catch her breath, gather herself. Ensign Arthur made her nervous. He was nice, or tried to be, but there was something strange about him, and he was always preaching unitology. He seemed just one step away from either asking her out on a date or inviting her along to a religious revival. Maybe both. And Groder, she had noticed, treated her a little differently than some of the others. Not enough to notice unless you paid close attention. It was hard to pin her finger on what it was exactly, but she was sure he did it. But she had no idea why. She made her way to the quarters, lying down on the bed for a while. The headache, if that was what it had been, was now completely gone. Strange that. But it hadn't been a headache exactly. Or not the headaches like but not the headaches like she usually knew them. There had been little flashes of something, images jagging like lightning into her head, but broken and incomplete, impossible for her to make into coherent shapes. It had been like watching a broken vid screen, one in the process of fuzzing out. She felt that there was something there to be seen, but she just couldn't see it. She lay on the bed, staring up at the ceiling. It was no secret to her that there were tensions between the commander and Ensign Arthur, and though Groder did little to give himself away, she noticed that there were things that he'd say around her that he wouldn't say around Arthur. It was, she supposed, a mark of privilege that he'd say them to her. She tried to take it that way, but she also had to admit that when she'd signed up for the academy, she hadn't imagined it would be like this. She didn't know what was going on down on the planet proper exactly, but she knew enough to know that she wouldn't approve if she knew more. She made which made her wonder why Groder had chosen her as part of his crew. What did he expect from her? She wondered for the 50th time. Why was she here? After she deemed sufficient time had elapsed, she washed her face and made her way back to the bridge. Arthur was still there, and he immediately tried to engage her. She mumbled an apology and slipped back into her work at her console. But the work itself wasn't holding her attention. There was little to do. They were hovering above Aspera, not orbiting the planet exactly, but doing a strange loop that unnecessarily expended fuel. It seemed to her, in which kept them in not orbiting the planet exactly, but doing a strange loop that unnecessarily expended fuel, it seemed to her, and which kept them in proximity to the structure below that she'd been the first to identify. Why they were doing it, she couldn't say. Groder had hinted about what was taking place on the planet, and she'd seen the supply ships come and pass through, seen as well another structure being built below over the course of a number of months. It was a research facility of some kind, but of what and for what exactly, she couldn't say. Someone had stopped to hover behind her. For a moment, she thought it was Arthur. She prepared herself to become irritated, snap something at him that might drive him back. But Arthur, she saw, was out of the corner of her eye, was still at his station. When she craned her neck, she saw it was Commander Groder. Do you mind explaining where that came from? He asked. What? She asked, and then he flicked his finger at her vid pad. With her stylus, she saw she'd been tracing something. It looked like a pair of tusks of some kind, but instead of curving, they twisted around one another. Funny, she thought. It looks like the unitology symbol. All of Arthur's talk about unitology must have sunk deeper into her skin than she realized. But it was different from the unitology symbol too, or at least more articulate. It was covered with dozens of small squiggles, distinct but bizarre symbols. I don't know, she said. What have you seen? He asked. What have you been up to? I haven't seen anything, she claimed. This doesn't mean anything to you, he asked. Then why did you draw it? She shook her head. Nothing, sir, she said. I swear I was just doodling. And what are these numbers? He asked, gesturing to the right edge of the pad. These equations? Were they equations? Well, yes, they looked like them. Probably just the remnants of some old navigation computations, she suggested. No, he said. They're not. No? Who have you shown this to? He asked. Shown? She said, confused. It was just a doodle. I haven't shown it to anybody. Why would I? Not Arthur? He asked. Of course not, she said. He stared at her for a long moment, as if assessing her, and then nodded. Forward it to me and then erase it, he said. And then we need to have a serious talk. Swallow that. Okay. Oh boy. Okay, water went down the wrong part of the throat. 18. Dr. Enoch Bryden was. Oh, I can still feel it. Sorry. Dr. Enoch Bryden was already drifting off to sleep when he felt it. The pulse had gone off again. He could feel it tugging at his mind, just for a moment, as if trying to unknot something, and then came a brief, sharp pain that put him wide awake. Interesting, he thought. The pain at the end, that was new, different from the last time. Something was changing, developing. He got out of bed and checked the time. 3 days since the last pulse, minus an hour or so. That made the 5th time. He pulled up the log and saw, as he suspected, no regular pattern, no sense they were coming in a particular order, though they were, he noticed, coming closer together now, as if the object that was emitting them was, so to speak, feeling its way around, looking for something. The technician on duty still hadn't called. Bryden knew not everybody was as sensitive to the pulse as he was. It was fortuitous that he was heading up the project, and even those who were sensitive to it didn't respond always in the same way. Some became nauseous or bled at the nose, some became agitated and violent. A very few, didn't seem to notice it at all. And perhaps the current technician on duty was one of those. If he didn't call within the next 60 seconds, Bryden would make a note of his name and have him reassigned to a job more appropriate to his level of awareness. Janitorial duties, for instance. No, there was no room for errors. The project was crucial. It might in fact change the course of humanity. There was no room for mistakes. 40 seconds. The technician still hadn't called, and so Bryden turned on his vid and called him. It took the man 8 tones to answer, and when he did, his eyes were red-rimmed and his hair was ruffled, as if he had been asleep. "Anything to report?" asked Bryden. "No, sir," the technician said, his eyes drifting to one side to look at his stats panel. Yes, sir, I mean, he said. "A pulse just came in." "Sleeping on the job?" asked Bryden. "No, sir," said the technician without batting an eye. Incompetent and a liar too, thought Bryden. "Give me your name," said Bryden. And a liar too, thought Bryden. "Give me your name," said Bryden, and when the technician gave it, he wrote it down. "When does your next shift end?" he asked. "In about an hour," said the technician. "Return to your quarters," said Bryden. "You've done enough damage for one night." The technician looked confused for a moment and then nodded, switched the vid off. "Do I have to do everything?" wondered Bryden as he got dressed. "Am I the only one who understands how important this is?" He left his quarters and made his way down the hall, deeper into the heart of the complex. He had been there since the beginning, ever since they'd first start constructing the red marker. At first, they'd been told that it was a 2-year tour, but then they'd been informed that the project was important enough that they'd have to remain on it, out of contact with the outside world until further notice. One of the others, a man with a family named Pete, had complained about that, and then had kept complaining, and then, when that didn't work, had started to result. He had been accused of treason, quickly tried, and then exiled from the research facility and remained to the penal colony a few miles distance. Even then, Pete hadn't understood, had continued to complain and beg to be released, had begun to reveal to the other prisoners the secrets of the research facility. So they had held another court, secret this time, and a few hours later, Pete was found dead on his cot. Bryden didn't particularly relish what happened to the man, but then again, he didn't object to it either. He should, at the very least, have known better. Besides, this was a sacred calling. Any scientist worth their salt would kill to have the chance that they had here. It still made his skin tingle to see it. Each time it was just as amazing as the first time. He reached the first set of doors, slid his card through, and entered the code. The door slid back. The technician, he was pleased to see, was gone, though he had left a mess at the console. Wadded up food wrappers, a single glove, a crumpled manifest. He swept it all into the incinerator chute without a second glance, then went to the glass window. There it was, just on the other side. Clear proof that humans were not alone, that humans were not the only form of intelligent life that had existed in the universe. Clear proof that Unitology was the only true religion and that Michael Altman had been a true prophet. It was perhaps 20 meters tall. It was a blackish red, cut in variegated stripes, and gave off at times an unearthly glow that the indecipherable symbols on its body burning with a curious light. Two slanting columns joined at the base, then twisted upward around one another. He and his team had constructed the marker using the black marker research from Earth. It was more grown than constructed, really, as a fractal heuristic crystal lattice. It was almost like a brain. On activating it, they could hardly keep up with cataloging the unexpected properties it exhibited, not limited to just these unsudden pulses. It seemed to him to possess some intelligence, seemed to be trying to communicate with him, Bryden. The others sometimes scoffed at him when he suggested this, but somehow he was sure of it. He could feel its pulse prodding at his mind, trying to find something that would respond to it. What it was looking for within him. How could he help it to find it? He opened the second set of doors and entered the chamber. Slowly he moved toward the marker, taking a moment first to take it all in. The floor of the chamber was bare exposed rock, rapidly cut so that they could begin. The prison colony site had been chosen because the military had realized that the life sentence prisoners might prove perfect experimental fodder for the marker experiments to come. They had started, though, by using some of them to build up the scientific compound where the red marker would be constructed. Of course, those prisoners had to be killed to preserve the secret, but they were doomed anyway. It didn't matter much. And with the way things were in the galaxy, there would always be new political prisoners to fill the colony and to be used if and when they were needed. Near the marker and a little farther out, near the walls, were little patches of what looked like fungus or rot, sloping tendrils. They were bigger than he remembered them being, and there were more of them. He'd begun to notice them in the halls as well, spreading somehow. He'd have to set the cleanup crew onto them. He reached out and placed his hand against the stone, but felt nothing unusual. It was, he knew, still sending a signal, just not in a way that his body or mind could perceive. The computers, though, were picking it up, recording it, trying to decipher it. He tried to keep his thoughts free and his mind open, listening inside his head for whatever the marker was trying to say to him, willing it to talk to him. "I'm ready," he told it mentally. "Take me." How long he waited like that, he didn't know. When nothing happened, he sighed and went back through the doors and into the control room, began to sort through the latest data. It took only a few moments for him to realize that the new data was inconsistent with the earlier data. It seemed that the pulse itself had begun to change, not only during the moment of pain he had felt in the end, but earlier as well. And now that the pulse had subsided, the marker was broadcasting on slightly different frequencies, something it had never done before. Apparently, the constructed marker had started to reorganize itself, continuing to grow and develop even after they'd finished the process. It wasn't something he'd expected. What did it mean? He was poring over the data, trying to assemble things into a coherent structure when other members of the team began to arrive. Callie Dexter was the first. She was second in command, but Bryden felt she did not have proper respect for what they were doing. She was a good scientist, but for her, the marker project didn't go beyond the science. She didn't have the proper level of either faith or awe, and thus could not be counted on. You're ready? What's on the docket for today? Oh, sorry, this is her talking. You're ready? What's on the docket for today? She asked when she came in and settled in at her console, right next to him. Bryden just grunted. Anything new? She asked. Lots, said Bryden. Major pulse last night. A few minutes later, Anna Tilton came in. She had dark brown hair, cut short so that it clung close to her face. Bryden liked her better. She understood things properly. Like him, she was a unitologist. And like him, she had understood that the black marker had been a gift, a glorious proof of the truth of their religion, and their work here to reconstruct it was a holy cause. They were trying to decipher the mind of God. She nodded at him as she came in, settled right in. A few moments later, the room was full, a dozen or so scientists and technicians, all of them going over the data and thinking about it according to their own specialities. They exchanged a few comments here and there, asked one another for clarifications, and prepared for the day's tests and experiments. Callie leaned over to Bryden. It's changing. What do you make of it? She asked. I don't know, said Bryden. I think it's trying to speak with us, however it can. And since we didn't seem to be listening to how it spoke before, it's trying out a new voice. You make it sound like it's alive, said Callie. Bryden shrugged. It almost acts like it sometimes, he said. Careful, doctor, cautioned Callie. Don't lose your objectivity. It made him angry. Dr. Dexter can't see what's right in front of her own eyes, he thought. It was a mistake to have anyone on a team who wasn't a unitologist. But when he suggested to the authorities having her removed, they denied his request. She was a good scientist, he had to admit that. But this wasn't just science. This was something bigger, something grander. She was staring at him, he realized, her gaze hard. Are you all right? She asked. Of course I'm all right, he said, and gave her a cold smile. He had to tolerate her for now, but maybe a time would come when he wouldn't have to. They worked in silence for a while until Callie said, He ignored her, kept sending his own data through the modeling system. Then she cleared her throat and said, Strange. What's strange? He asked. The vector, she said. Of course there's a vector, he said. There's always been a vector, several in fact. Ours broadcast out into space. Dr. Dexter shook her head. That's just it, she said. She scooted her chair closer to him, turning the screen so she could show him. See here, she said. There's the unidentified signal we caught the other day. Keep your voice down, said Bryden in a low voice. Not everybody in this room has our security clearance. Dr. Dexter smiled. It hardly matters, Bryden. With what we already know, we're all already a huge security risk. She reached up and traced her finger along the screen. Now, something else is coming from here, a few dozen systems away. Looks like it could be a Kremar, or that the signal cuts through anything. And here's us. She shadowed the other vectors, making them nearly invisible, and brightened this one. Then she scrolled it backward in time. Watch this, she said. Here we are, broadcasting indiscriminately with an occasional pulse. But the pulses are wide. And then this morning, boom, sharper focus. It's just a different frequency, said Bryden. Okay, she said. Could be. But the other pulses were all directed up into space off planet. This one is angled differently. Half of it is simply bouncing off the ground. The rest of it travels the planet's surface pretty closely. It's never done that before. Maybe that explained the pain at the end, thought Bryden. Maybe that was what made it different. To Dr. Dexter, he said, why would it do that? She gave him a look. You think it's alive, she said. You tell me. When he didn't, she said, maybe it found what it wanted. Bryden nodded. And what would that be? Dr. Dexter shrugged. I don't know, she said. Give me more data and maybe we'll find out. 19. A strange veil of light seemed to hang before Istvan's eyes, tattered and inconsistent, like a curtain made from bits and scraps of rag. In it he could see figures moving, swaying back and forth, hiding and coming forth. They were there and not there at the same time. I'm dreaming, he thought. But no, he wasn't dreaming. His eyes were wide open, though through the veil of light, just on the other side of it, he could see the cell around him. And he could feel that he was lying on his cot. Someone was crouching over him, but the light was such it was impossible to see the man's face. For a moment, he thought it was a small gray man, but then the curtain swayed and he saw enough to know it wasn't him. The man's head was too large, but still spun over with light, its features difficult to make out. He tried to move his lips to talk, but found his teeth clenched tightly shut, his breath hissing angrily through them. Just relax, said the man obscured by the light. It's all right, calm down. He tried to calm down, but he couldn't. He could feel the man shaking his shoulder. And then that slowly passed and was gone, as if he no longer had a body anymore. A roaring filled his ears, and the veil of light grew brighter and brighter until he could see nothing behind it. And there was a buzzing pain where his head used to be. All he could see was light, featureless and bare, and stretching on forever. And then, slowly, he began to make out a flexing and falling of different shapes, like boiling water, but still all the same light, barely distinguishable. At first the forms seemed to make no sense, seemed merely random patterns, but then they began to adapt, to adjust. He could feel his mind working with them, making them something different, something he could understand. How did his mind know how to do such a thing? Was this like the voices? But there were no voices, only shapes. It was the opposite of voices, but his mind could make something of it somehow, and he was helpless to do anything but watch. At first, the shapes were geometrical, simple straight lines, and then simple forms, slowly becoming more and more complex, dissolving into one another phantasmagorically. But then they began to warp and bend, becoming a collapse of form and then slowly taking on the shapes of faces. They were simple at first, cartoonish and immobile, but gradually they became more and more articulated, more and more human. They were still obscured, nearly lost in the light that created them, but they were more and more convincing. Here a head shot forth, even whiter light pouring out of its eyes, and burst. Another white shape arose and turned toward him and seemed to notice him. It was just a head without a body, but able somehow to move nonetheless, its neck pulsing it forward. It came toward him, its eyes curious, growing larger as it came until it seemed to fill nearly all his vision. as if it were just inches from his own head. It was hard not to imagine that he could feel its breath on his against his face. And then it smiled, its mouth opening up jaggedly and too far, as if its cheeks had been shut and its jaw dislocated. He screamed. The white face screamed back, mimicking loudly, too loudly, and then capsized on itself, dissolving back into the light. He tried to slow his breathing, tried to bring his body back, but it wouldn't come. He couldn't find his body nestled anywhere under the light. And then he realized that something was forming again. A head coming up again. The same head as before, but a little more distinct this time. Light shot through with strands that were less illuminated, as the muscles and sinews and tendons began to form into a slab-like and brutal face, which it took him some time to recognize as his own. It was a shock to see himself like that, embodied in light. He felt his mind push out against it, and the face suddenly began to reform, becoming not his face, but that of his brother. No, that was too painful in a different way, and he felt his mind push again until there she was, his mother. He hated her. But here he didn't hate her exactly. No, here it was more like he was afraid of her. Seeing her like that, formed all out of light, was terrifying. "What are you doing here?" he asked, and far away, down wherever his body currently resided, he felt someone squeeze his hand. "What are you doing here?" the mother face repeated, its mouth moving awkwardly, wrongly. It seemed unable to make sense of the gaps between words, just ran everything together and then waited, staring expectantly at him. Which was, he realized, how he must be staring at it. When he said nothing, the face let out a stream of raw sound, ululations and yelps, clamors and groans, a strange, unearthly combination of sounds that left him feeling raw and damaged. And then it stopped, waited. "What do you want?" he asked, as much to keep the face from sounding off as anything else. "What do you want?" the mother voice responded. "You first," he said. "You first." And then, as suddenly as it had gone, the light began to fade again, becoming first that tattered veil that half obscured things, and then going away altogether. He was thrown panting, teeth aching, back into the world. Waldron was there beside him, gripping his hand. "That's right," he was saying. "Just relax. It'll be okay." Several of the other prisoners were there too, gathered around him. Slowly he disentangled his hand, pushing them away enough to sit up and hold his head in his hands. He closed his eyes, and when he opened, it was a creeping tendril. Some of that moss or corruption. It hadn't been there before, but suddenly it was there. Was it real? Would the others see it too? "What happened?" asked Waldron. He just shook his head helplessly, stared at the tendril. "Do you have fits like that a lot? You were shaking so hard it was all we could do to get you into bed." He lifted his head. "It saw me," he said. "What?" said one of the other men. "What do you mean?" "It was staring right at me," he said. "And then it spoke. But it was saying the things I was saying, only wrong. And then it spoke in a way that I couldn't understand." "Isfin," said Waldron, shaking his head. "None of us know what you're talking about." "It's out there. You just can't always see it." "You're crazy," said Bill. "We already knew he was crazy," said Michael. But this is a new type of crazy, said Bill. It's worth nothing. It's worth noting. What is it exactly? Asked Waldron, his eyes narrowing. White. All white, said Isfin. No, made of light. But maybe that's not really it. But just what I could see. Changing faces. Hard to remember it wasn't the person it looked like. For a while, it was me. You're babbling, said one of the others. For a while, it was me, said Istvin again. Waldron patted him on the shoulder. Well, if it comes back, ask it if it can help us get out of here, he said. He turned to leave the cell, shooing the others in front of him. Come on, boys. Show's over. 20. Every indication Jency had was that Aspera was an unoccupied, uncolonized planet. It was off the beaten track, not even rich in resources, hardly worth a second glance, which perhaps made it the perfect place for a secret political prison. But since it was uncolonized, I can't say this word. But since it was uncolonized and off the beaten track, the question Jency kept asking himself was how he sorry. But since it was uncolonized and off the beaten track, the question Jency kept asking himself was how was he to get there? He didn't have money to pay for passage on the ship, even if there had been a ship going there, let alone enough to charter his own vessel. And the attempt to enter the sector was likely to set off alarm bells. Surely it was carefully patrolled, and anyone coming close would be turned back. He spent a few days thinking about what to do. He dug up what information he could, but there was almost nothing to indicate the Aspera was anything but an uncolonized, inhospitable world. Oh my God. Through a stolen pass, an unlocked terminal behind closed doors in the ports, and a little of his brother's creative hacking, he managed to spend a few minutes with closed military records before being locked out. Enough to come away with the impression that there was something happening on the planet after all, though what exactly it was remained vague. Some indication that, yes, there was a political prison there, but perhaps more than that. Another project was hinted at, but remained very top secret. It was only referred to as Operation Aspera. At first, he thought that that must be the name for the prison, but no, the prison was called simply and relatively unimaginably Hell. Operation Aspera was something else. But figuring this out brought him no closer to figuring out how to get to the planet. It took him a few days for it to hit him. If the planet was If the planet was inhospitable, then nothing could grow there, unless they had a hydroponic facility. But even so, they need other supplies, so that there must be someone bringing supplies in every few months or so, maybe more often, maybe less. That had to be his way in. It was, in any case, the only possible way in he could think of. It would take another trip to the spaceport, Balaclava, and the appropriation of a little more security clearance. He waited until the day shift was ending and then followed the security manager out of his office and forced him from behind into a supply closet where he gagged and bound him. He took the man's key card, used them to get back into his system. From there, it took a while, but following what his brother had taught him, he cracked his way from there to the military side. He was there for just a moment before the system shut him out, but saw enough to find mention of the name of a freighter with security clearance for the sector where Aspera was to be found. The Eben. From there it was back to port records. He scanned through the billings. He scanned through the bills of lading for the Eben, and found it making a trip to a classified location every 3 months or so. The last one a little over 2.5 months previous. That didn't give him much time. The cargo was as to be expected for a prison camp. Food and medical supplies, vast quantities of water as well. But there was other cargo as well, specialized scientific equipment, computer wear, surgical supplies. It was easy to locate the freighter. It was in a military berth, though, and well protected. He scanned the vid listings to see if they were looking for crew. They weren't. From a terminal at his picker job, he could access past manifests for the Eben, including names and pictures of the crew. There were two freight specialists, basically glorified pickers, one of them a large Swede named Swanson, the other a smaller man named Talbot. Both were listed in the public directory. Swanson had a few apart- Swanson had a small apartment fairly near the spaceport, just a few blocks away from Chensi's own place. Talbot lived on the far side of the dome. For a few days, Jency followed Talbot home from work, then hung around his place afterward to see where he went. He never seemed to go anywhere. From the street, Jency could see the blue light of the vid flickering on the walls around him. The man hardly seemed to have any sort of life. So he switched to Swanson, who went directly from the spaceport to a bar called the Martyr almost every night. He would always take the same place at one end of the bar, ease his large body carefully down onto the narrow stool. He was apparently enough of the regular that the stool was always empty when he arrived. The first night, Jency took a stool around the corner of the bar, a few stools between him and Swanson. He waited until Swanson had ordered his beer and then nodded. The man crinkled his eyes at him in confusion, then nodded back. He watched Swanson order half a dozen beers, one about every 10 minutes or so, and then promptly at the end of an hour, leave. Getting up, he waggled his way off the chair, a slightly waviness to his stride, but basically okay. Jency considered following him home, but instead stayed where he was. The next time, Jency was already seated when Swanson arrived. He nodded once to the man. Swanson was nearly done with his third beer, and then got himself another beer, ordering around for Swanson as well. The Swede nodded his thanks and quickly drained the glass, but Taciturn, I don't know how to say this word, Taciturn said nothing to Jency, made no attempt to start a conversation. And just as before, after an hour had passed, he promptly stood and left, moving awkwardly and ponderously out the door. Later that evening, Jency began to think, what if this doesn't work? What sort of backup plan should I have? But he could think of no plan. If he wanted to get on board the Eben, this had to work. The third night, when Swanson came into the bar, Jency had already taken the stool beside his own. Swanson grunted once to him, nodded slightly, and then squeezed his way onto the stool. Jency ordered himself a beer and turned to Swanson. Want one too? He asked. You're paying? Asked Swanson. Sure, said Jency. Why not? Swanson nodded. The bartender brought them their beers and they drank for a while in silence. Finally, Jency said, You're at the port? Swanson nodded. You too? He said. Jency nodded back. I'm a picker, he said. The big Swede cracked a smile. A picker, he said. That's no kind of life. No? What do you do? Freight too, said the Swede. Not that much different than a picker, but the pay is a lot better. He took a big sip of his drink, and for a moment Jency thought that was all he was going to say. He was afraid to push it. He didn't want to seem too eager. Indeed, it was all he did say for a while, through the end of his first beer and all the way through his second, until somewhere well into the middle of his third. You have to get on a ship going off planet, Swanson finally said, his speech slightly slurred now. Somewhere that wants you to load up and travel with the goods and then unload it too. That's where the money is. Sounds good, said Jency. How do I go about it? Swanson shook his head. Have to just ask around, he said. Place I'm at is full. And where's that? The Eben, said Swanson. Nice ship. New. Specialized. When do you ship out next? Jency asked. Swanson frowned. Week and a half, he said. More or less. That was as far as it went that night. The next night, though, Jency was back, again buying the beer, and Swanson spoke a little more. Best pay comes with cargo that you don't know much about, he said, and winked. But us, all we know are the basic categories listed on the bill of lading. That's all we usually know, said Jency. Yes, but you're a picker, said Swanson, becoming more loquacious. You just pick up the job at the beginning or the end. All you have to know is how fragile it is or isn't. We have to load the cargo and ride it with it the whole way and unload it. Usual jobs, they give us pretty specific content listings so that we'll know what to do if something goes wrong. He swiveled on his bar stool until he was looking directly at Jency. His eyes, Jency saw, were slightly glazed. Something spills, say. Something goes wrong. It's good to know what you're carrying and whether it might blow up or explode or burn through the deck. But some of these jobs, he said and took a drink. No, take that back. One job that we keep doing. They'll put a label on the box, say that says medical supplies, but when it accidentally gets knocked open, it isn't medical supplies at all, but sealed vats of some sort of acid. I ask you, how can that be medical supply? So they're smugglers, said Jency. So they're smugglers, said Jency. Swanson prodded Jency's. I didn't say that, he said. These are government men. They just don't want people to know where they're going and what they're prepared to do once they get there. But you figure it out, said Jency. Swansea shook his head. No reason to figure it out, he said. Better just go along with it and get paid. People who start trying to figure stuff like that out always end up in trouble. Which is probably exactly where I'm headed, thought Jency. By the end of the week, they were more or less friends, with Swanson talking almost as much as an ordinary human, though prone to odd fits of silence as well. Several times, Swanson slapped him on the back, said he was going to miss him once he shipped out. Maybe a spot will open up, said Jency. Swanson shook his head. It won't. If it does, I'll put in a good word for you. You're a picker, but I bet you could do it. Two choices, thought Jency, as he waited in the bar the next day for Swanson to come in. Just 3 days before Swanson shipped out. He could do as his original plan had suggested, and simply drug Swanson, make him incapable of showing up for work. He had a twist of ground-up sleeping pills in his pocket that he could pour into the man's beer. It'd be enough to knock the Swede out, maybe would make him sleep for a few days. And then when he didn't show up for work, Jency could be there, asking around for work, just happening to have a specialization in cargo. But he liked Swanson. That was the problem. Talbot, on the other hand, he hardly knew, and Swanson was likely to think to call on him if Talbot didn't show up for work. The odds were better, but the question was how to bring it smoothly about. And as ideas flitted back and forth within his head, he began to ask himself, how far am I willing to go for my brother? I'll break the laws for him. I'll force someone out of their job just to have a chance to see him. What else will I do? Would I kill someone for him? He shook his head. No. He had to be careful. He couldn't let this quest for his brother, a quest for a brother who might now be damaged enough to not even recognize him if he were to find him, make him into a different person than he was. He couldn't let go of himself just to find his brother. That afternoon, he quit his job. His boss was a little surprised and started to protest that he needed some notice, but in the end he sighed, counted out. Jency went out and brought a roll of duct tape, then went to the apartment building where Talbot lived. He rang several bells until someone buzzed him in. The apartment was on the third floor, the door a cheap affair, and by leaning into the door and jiggling the doorknob forcing a card in, he managed to pop the lock out of its groove and go in. Inside, the apartment was immaculate. Nothing out of place. Two clean plates sat side by side on the counter with a knife and fork crossed over each in an X, with two glasses arranged in perfect symmetry above them. The cabinets were mostly empty, though one was full of identical cans of food. The bed was made the bathroom exceptionally clean. In a way, it was hard to believe anybody lived there at all. He wandered around the apartment for a while, thinking. In the office, he found a pen and a piece of paper and wrote, "Your next job," followed by the picking company's vid contact. Was that giving too much away? Putting too much at risk? Maybe. But he had a hard enough life himself that he couldn't see himself taking away a man's livelihood, even a man as strange and repressed as Talbot. He left it on the kitchen table, where it lay awkwardly, the only object in the apartment to seem out of place. By the time Talbot had come home from work and had opened the door, Jency had his balaclava on and was hiding behind it. The small man came through and Jency hit him hard twice in the temple, quick, jabbing blows. Talbot gave a strange, breathless cry and fell in a heap. Jency dragged him over to a chair and taped his arms and legs to it. When Talbot was secure, Jency poured a glass of water and sprinkled the twist of crushed sleeping tablets into it. He waited for the man to come around, but nothing seemed to be happening. He waited some more, then pulled a chair closer to him and placed his fingers against his neck. No pulse. It seemed absurd, an accident of fate. He stripped off his balaclava and quickly unbound Talbot and laid him flat. Tried to give him artificial respiration, pumped his chest, but it had been too long. The blood was already seeping lower in the body and pooling, leaving the face pale and waxen. He left the body and slumped into the couch, holding his head with his hands. It was his fault. He had hit the man too hard, or maybe just bad luck. Maybe Talbot had some sort of condition that he should have known about, a heart problem, say. In any case, the first thing he should have done when the man went down was check his pulse and made sure he was still breathing. Now he had traded the chance of seeing his brother for another man's life. How many others would fall forfeit along the way? After a while, he got up and removed the remaining duct tape from Talbot's arms and legs and from the chair. He dragged the man into the other room and positioned him in an armchair in front of his vid, then turned it on to one of the broadcasts. The body was already a little stiff, but it bent for him with a little pressure and settled into the chair. Maybe it would look like he died there. He carefully positioned the kitchen chair back where it had been at the table, then washed out the glass containing the water and crushed sleeping pills, arranging it back where it had been before. The note he tore into fourths and slipped into his pocket, along with the twist of paper. He took one last look over the apartment and then, thinking there was nothing else he could do, left. The next morning he was down at the port early, ostensibly to see Swanson off. The big man, upon seeing him, came over and swatted his shoulder with his big hand. "No more drinking together, eh?" he said, his eyes twinkling. "Now you'll have to drink alone." He introduced Jency to Captain Martin, who shook his hand. My friend Jency, Swanson said. One of the best pickers there is, but ready to move on to more serious freight. Keep it in mind if you ever have an open position. Captain Martin just nodded, made small talk for a moment, and then went back to making preparations that would take them up to the Eben, currently in orbit. Swanson shook his head again and then left. Jency hung around a little bit more and then, not wanting to seem too needy or conspicuous, went home. The next few hours were hard ones. As he waited by the vid for them to contact him, what if they didn't? What if they had someone else in mind or simply decided that they could manage without an additional person to take Talbot's place? Then Talbot would have died for no reason, and he, Jency, would have gotten no further toward figuring out how to see his brother. He imagined the captain, or perhaps Swanson, or perhaps someone else realizing that Talbot wasn't there. Then trying to call him by vid, then sending someone running toward his place to check on him and finding the dead body. Would it seem that he had died of natural causes? Would there be a suspicious bruise on his temple where Jency had struck him? An hour went by, then two without word. He was close to giving up and abandoning it altogether when the vid flickered on and he saw the captain's face. He accepted the connection. Mr. Jency Sato, the captain said. Yes, said Jency. Didn't know that I'd find you at home, he said, but here you are. Swing shift today, Jency lied, hoping that he hadn't managed to track down which picker he worked for and discovered that he had quit. I go in a few minutes. Maybe not, said the captain. How would you like to come work for me? Work for you, he said. What's the pay? The captain gave him a figure that was nearly double his picking job. You come highly recommended by Swanson, he said. I trust his judgment. Only catch is that you'd have to start today. Jency pretended to think about it, then nodded. What time do you want me? He asked. Immediately. We're already in orbit and waiting for you. There's a shuttle waiting in the port. Pack your things and catch it right away. No delaying now. We'll leave as soon as you get up here. He nodded and cut the vid. He took a deep breath, and he was one step closer to seeing his brother. Okay. Sorry, I'm just seeing how long the next chapter is and trying to decide whether or not I should continue on. You know what? Yeah. Let's try. Let's try to continue on for another chapter, thereby making the next ones slightly less. 21. Isfin could never tell when the world was going to change. Other world was there, but deep in the background. A dull, whispery rumbling, like a voice talking to him from very, very far away. But then, unexpectedly, pain would bloom in his head, and the veil would descend again, and then it was the world of the penal colony that was almost lost in the background, in the whir and rush of this other place that took over. Which was the real world? Or were they both real? Or neither? Each time that inversion took place, when things reverted to normal, that other world was just slightly less in the background, just slightly louder, just slightly more noisy. He could tell that the other prisoners were beginning to feel it too, though they didn't know what they felt. But they didn't know that they felt it. Whatever was making the pain in his head was throwing up or tearing down the veil was simply tickling their hindbrain a little or scratching it enough to slowly rub it raw. They felt it, but didn't always know they were feeling it. They were more jumpy than they had been, and some of them seemed at times to have difficulty with their heads. They became angry, said things they not only didn't mean but didn't understand. For once, Istin felt like he wasn't the one who was behind. He could see things that the others couldn't, and he could see its effect on them, even if they couldn't. He tried to remain calm. He slept in his cell at night. When the alarm went off and the doors automatically slid open, he went out with the rest of them, did his best to talk and converse and pretend like he was a person just like the rest of them. But he had never been very good at that, and soon he'd lose the thread. He knew he was different. The three who he'd first sat by at the table, Bill, Michael, and Waldron, seemed to tolerate him best, and he found himself drawn to them as well. Maybe because of that, or maybe just because he had sat by them first. He could see it affecting them as well, whatever it was, but differently. When the world began to recede for Isman, it made Michael simply withdraw into himself. Waldron became manic, overexcited. Bill began to mumble to himself, his face slowly taking on a smile, until the world came back and they all became more or less like they'd been before, though not quite. Each time they had a little farther to come back, and each time they stopped a hair or two shorter. Maybe it was partly the penal colony itself that made it worse. There they were, free in a manner of speaking, but with their world limited to a circle within another circle around it, knowing that there was a third circle that they could not enter, and that from there people were watching them. Isvin had always felt watched, had felt there was, just out of his line of vision, someone observing him. But in the past, nobody else around him had seemed to feel that way. It was reassuring in a way to know that now he was feeling something that everyone else was feeling. That as far as they were concerned, he was right. Over the course of several weeks, the veil became more and more prominent for Isvin, fading away into a burst of light, out of which came figures from his past who spoke to him. It was, though he did not know why, either always the dead or people that were dead to him. At first, he might see the face of his brother, even the face of one of his fellow prisoners, done over in white lines and in light like an inverted self. But something about that seemed to trouble him, and whatever was sending him these visions seemed to sense this, adjusted itself slightly to fit what his mind would bear. Why was it reassuring for him to see the faces of the dead rather than the living? He didn't know. He suspected that it wouldn't be reassuring for most people, might even make some of them lose their minds. But for him, perhaps, it simply helped him to distinguish between the world of the penal colony and this other, newer world. As time went on, the light slowly faded. This new world took on color and depth, and had it not been for the pain that filled his head when it came, and the fact that he could recognize the faces as the faces of the dead, he might not have known which world he was seeing. But why, he wondered, do I see my mother? She might be dead, but he didn't know for certain whether she was or not. Maybe it was as he thought before, that she was simply dead to him. Or maybe she really was dead, and the vision was telling him this by dressing itself up in her face and speaking in her voice. But more and more often, the face that came to him, the face that slowly gelled and came out of the light and created a world around it, was the councilman he had killed, Tim Fisher. The man came to him with a broken head and a strange, clomping stride. He spoke in the same voice Fisher himself had used, though how this might be possible, Isvin could not say. For a long time, the voice remained strange, simply repeating what Isvin himself said, but in a fashion that ran all the words together, as if it were repeating something it didn't understand. You're dead, Isvin might say. You're dead. Fisher's voice echoed back, the head slowly oozing blood. What do you want to tell me? He asked, and the voice repeated it back. It was a little like being in a nightmare, but fascinating too. How can I understand it? He wondered. How can I make it understand me? The bursts of power were coming more frequently, and the faces, when they appeared, seemed more and more attentive, as if they were paying close attention just to him. He found they looked closest at him when he turned numbers about in his head, built structures and patterns with them, as if he'd been doing since he was a boy. What interested them about that, he didn't know. Were any of the others feeling it? He didn't think so. He couldn't tell for certain, but each of the several dozen other prisoners seemed to take in the bursts in a different way. And as these bursts increased, people changed in a way that Isfin thought of as their true selves bubbling further out. They became raw, more erratic, in a way that he understood. And for him, despite his visions being all the more intense, he felt like his true self was already closer to the surface. He could cope with it better than they could. One of the prisoners, a man named Brian Kahn, couldn't cope with it at all. It was after lunch. Several prisoners walked the perimeter of the inner circle. A few of them worked out on exercise machines. A few others were still sitting at the tables and reading. Bill and Waldron were talking, mumbling away, their conversations getting more heated as Isfin felt the pressure in his head increasing. The burst of energy started to come. The veil sprang up again, then the world it contained, and Isfin stayed there as silent as he could, not wanting to speak to the face belonging to Councilman Fisher in front of the others, but also not able to see or even really hear the two men sitting next to him. He stayed there with his jaw clenched, staring into the bloody face that stared mercilessly back at him, feeling at a far distance the touch of someone, either Bill or Waldron, he couldn't tell which. Seconds passed, or minutes, and then the face blackness, and the veil became tattered again, and he could see the real world again through the veil, and could hear, too, a sound that sounded like screaming. But it was quickly cut off. Waldron was gripping his shoulder hard, not as he might have thought, because he had noticed that Isfin was having one of his visions, but rather because of what he was seeing in front of him. "What the hell?" Waldron said. He was staring straight ahead of him, and Bill, too, had turned around and was staring, so Isfin stared as well. Khan was there, a few tables over, and for a second, perhaps two, Isfin had no idea what he should be looking at. And then he saw the handle of the fork rising from Khan's forearms where he had plunged it in. Khan opened his mouth and screamed again. He reached down and tugged the fork free, and blood began to pump up from the wound, quicker than Isfin would have thought possible. He plunged it in again, a little further up the arm, but just as deep, and screamed yet again. "What the fuck is wrong with him?" asked Bill. But Isfin couldn't think of a way to answer this question that would make sense to Bill. There was too much to explain, and Isfin never knew what words to use. It was as if Khan had touched the other world and he had brought some of it back with him, and it had lodged inside his brain. And then it had turned that part of his brain inside out and made it into something else. He didn't think it meant any harm, that it was just trying to figure out a way to speak with him. But even if it didn't mean harm, it did not understand how much it could do with a brain without breaking it. "We have to stop him," said Waldron, and started toward Khan. But by this time the fork was out again and plunged deep into his throat, slicing open his carotid artery and puncturing his windpipe. Waldron reached Khan as he wavered and fell off the bench. He pressed his hand to Khan's neck as the blood spurted through his fingers and as the man sucked for air and quickly died. Waldron kept holding his hand there, staring at Khan as if he were looking at a ghost. The others had come and pulled him away and make him stand back. But after doing that, they didn't know what else to do. They all just stood there, a few yards away from the body, motionless, not knowing what to do next. "Khan," thought Isfin, staring at the man, memorizing his face. There would be a new face that would come to him now in the other world, he knew. He would now have a visit from the freshly dead. They must have been there only a few more seconds when the alarm sounded, calling them back to their cells. A few of them went back immediately, but most of them just milled about until an echoing voice issued from the loudspeakers attached to one of the struts of the dome. "Return to your cells," the voice said. "You have 30 seconds. This is your only warning." With that, most of the rest began to move, though one or two remained. Bill led both Isven and the still stunned and bloodied Waldron back to their cells. Isven sat on his bed until the cell door clanged shut, and then Waldron, and then approached the bars and holding onto them and staring out. He caught down the hall a fluid flash of black as 4 or 5 guards in riot gear rushed from the normally closed security door that led to the next ring through their ring and into the central circle. Then there was the sound of cries. Isfin could not see them, but imagined them setting up the prisoners who had disobeyed with their truncheons. And indeed, a few moments later, 2 guards rounded the corner, dragging an unconscious and bloody prisoner between them. They let him flop down on the hallway, not far from Isfin's cell. Their faces were covered with plastic shields, the lights bouncing off of them, which almost, Isfin thought, a little astounded, made them look like they had no face at all, or like their faces were made of light, just like the faces of the other world. One of the guards kicked the prisoner once, and then both turned and went back around the corridor and into the inner circle. A few moments later, all the guards went through again, carrying Khan's corpse out of the penal colony and into the outer ring. The door closed, and then there was nothing but silence. Or below even the beating of his own heart, Isfin could hear the whispering of voices. Very difficult to hear, almost impossible. But he heard them. He couldn't make out what they were saying, but he tried to listen to them nonetheless. Okay, so that is where I'm going to stop reading for today. This is actually what I originally intended to read from chapter 12 to 21. I decided maybe it was going to be too long, but I felt I could actually handle it. But I'm going to end the set here. So next time, either Tuesday, Thursday, or even next Sunday, we're going to continue on with part 3 from chapter 22 to the end of part 4, which is 31. So until next time, guys, thank you for liking if you like. Thank you for commenting if you commented. Thank you for subscribing if you subscribed. Thank you for favoriting if you favorited. Thank you for simply clicking on this video. Until next time, guys, see ya. End stream.